Hi, and welcome to the 61st in our series on Middle Eastern Islamic history. Today, we're going to be talking about the Colonial Maghreb, that means the part of Northern Africa, which contains Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia, and Libya. And the rules for those of you who are unfamiliar. This is not an academic presentation. I am not an academic. I'm not credentialed in history, religion, politics, or any of the topics that we will be discussing today. And I'm going to try and give this presentation from a secular perspective, not trying to bias against the colonizers or the colonized, trying to present the complexity of the situation as it existed in those different regions. And of course, like all topics that we cover in Middle Eastern history, this is, of course, a contentious topic. So we should abide by Will Wheaton's rule of being respectful. That said, I love interactivity, questions, comments, clarifications. Please put those in the chat. I do read the chat and will respond in real time. And what I like to say is that these presentations on classes are 101s and 201s, by which I mean 101, if you don't know anything, I'll catch you up. And 201, that if you know the basics of this situation, then I'm probably going to tell you stuff that is still beyond that, and that's what you'll cling on to. I also am going to do what I typically do, which is a 2-hour hard stop, meaning that if I haven't presented all my slides, that's okay. I'll just present them in the next time that we're going to meet up. It turns out this next Thursday coming up, I won't be available. So our next meeting will be in 2 Thursdays. And at that point, we're going to talk about post-World War II in the Middle East, which is incredibly exciting, I think, especially for many of the people here who have lived through that experience. When I put dates below a person, those are typically years of service. If they are a political figure, somebody appointed to a specific role, governor, emperor, what have you. And if they are a thought leader, it's their years of life. And obviously, if somebody's time span is only 3 years, that's probably their political reign. This, like all the other entries in this series, will be recorded, and you can see it on our YouTube channel. This is actually being live streamed on that YouTube channel. And the other 60 episodes in the Middle Eastern History series, along with all of the other series that we produce, are on that YouTube channel. So I would encourage you to subscribe, and you can watch the previous recordings to get an even fuller and richer view of the current episodes. And I would encourage you, if you want to be on the Zooms, to join our meetup, and you will see the links for the Zoom calls in the meetup. And if you enjoy what we provide, of course, we don't charge anything to listen to these, but we appreciate donations by PayPal or buy a coffee, because Zoom, Meetup, and YouTube are all premium subscriptions and cost us a little bit of money to maintain. So we appreciate that always. So moving on to North Africa, it's important to remember where these countries were coming from before the 19th century to really see what the colonial issue was. And when it comes to Morocco, we really have to look and understand that Morocco is composed of 4 different dominant ethnic groups. 3 of those ethnic groups are what are called Amazigh, or have been popularly called by the exonym Berber. The term Berber is usually not used as much anymore because it comes from the term barbarian, right? That was the term that was used by Romans to refer to them. Amazigh is the word that they use to refer to themselves. So that's generally the more accepted term. And the Amazigh divide into 3 separate groups. You have the Zenata, who live close to the coastline. These tend to be relatively Arabized in terms of their language and their dress. They also tend to be much more willing to work with foreign populations because they have more exposure to them. Then as you go into the mountains, you have the Masmuda, and the Masmuda tend to be more traditional and tend to have less Arab cultural mixture. And the last one is once you pass the Atlas Mountains and are on the desert side of Morocco, you have the Sanhaja. And the Sanhaja include tribes like the Tuareg, who are very famous for crossing the desert. They're famous for their blue head coverings. And so we're going to see sort of the interplay between all 3 of these. But what's interesting is that during the period of the Alawite dynasty, none of these 3 was actually in power. The group in power was actually the Sharifians, which are Moroccans who claim pure or nearly pure Arabian descent, right? They came from Saudi Arabia or other regions on the Arabian Peninsula centuries ago. They moved into Morocco. They cohabitated with these three types of Berbers, these three types of Amazigh. And eventually, when the Alawite dynasty, the current ruling dynasty of Morocco, both at this time and in the present, came to power, that was a Sharifian dynasty. And they legitimated themselves through their connection, not just to Arabia, but even to Prophet Muhammad's family. And we also talked about in our previous discussions that Morocco was the site of numerous invasions. One of the things that people often forget about the Reconquista, which was the Christian attack from northern Spain into southern Spain and to Christianize the Islamic Andalusia, is that it didn't end, strictly speaking, with the conquest of southern Spain, of Granada. And so you have both Portuguese and Spaniards attacking the territory along the coast of Morocco. In fact, the Portuguese set up a number of different colonies along the coast. The Portuguese were particularly famous for creating maritime colonies, which is that they would control a fortress along the sea. You can see the fortress of Mazagan, which is the current Moroccan city of Al-Jadida. And these fortress cities would effectively be under Portuguese control, surrounded by Moroccan-controlled land. And as Morocco moved away from the 16th century, Morocco was able to consolidate its territory, especially under the rule of the early Alawites. And by the end of the 18th century, Morocco was sort of charting a middle path, trying to create relationships with both European states and, of course, the newest European-esque state, the United States. And so Morocco was actually one of the first countries to recognize the United States. You can see this letter where George Washington and Sidi Mohammed, who was at that time the Alawite king of Morocco, exchanged information and exchanged recognition. So the US-Morocco relationship actually managed to be relatively successful. And you can see that already we have a US consulate based in Morocco, and Morocco became the US entry point into a lot of other areas in Northern Africa. So when it came to negotiation with the Dey of Algeria, the Pashas of Libya, and the Beys that existed in Tunisia, it was the Moroccans that served as the intermediary for the United States' presence in the region. Now, we should be clear that the United States' presence in North Africa at the beginning of the 19th century was minimal. The United States had very limited power projection. And so most of the relationship was in terms of trade and in terms of avoiding piracy. Morocco was a minimal pirate power, but the other three states of the Maghreb were in the business of piracy. And we'll talk a little bit more about that when we talk about Algeria. There's a question of, did Morocco have any resources that the US was interested in? At this time, no. In the current year, the US is primarily interested in phosphates that Morocco can provide. That's Morocco's really number one export from a basal perspective. But during this period, there really wasn't much that the United States was looking for from Morocco. A lot of the trade was simply to stem the possibility of piracy. So as we move into the 19th century, we have a distinct relationship forming, and this is the relationship that forms around the French interest in Algeria. Now, for context, and we're going to see this more when we look at the Algerian side, the French have begun to move into Algeria by 1830 and are starting to advance further into the territory by the 1840s. In fact, they're at this point fighting the rebellion of Abdelqadir al-Jaza'iri. We've talked about Jaza'iri on several occasions. And he is resisting the pacification of Algeria. Again, we're going to talk about this more in detail when we get to the Algerian side. But part of this is that the French begin to see a number of Abdelqadir al-Jaza'iri's forces withdrawing into the territory of Morocco in order to escape the French, right? Because this is a distinct government, and this distinct government was one that was giving at least a certain degree of refuge to these Algerian fighters. Now, it's important to point out that the Sultan, based in Rabat, didn't have a significant amount of control over these outlying regions. You can see the French invasion at Isla, which is on the Moroccan-Algerian border. You can also see that the French sent gunboats to both Tangier and Mogador, the modern city of Essaouira, in 1844 as a show of power over the Moroccans. The battles themselves were relatively quick, and the French signed a decisive treaty with the Moroccans, forcing the Moroccans not only to cede territory, but to join the French in the attacks on Abdelqadir al-Jaza'iri and other Algerian resistance to French control. Now, there's a comment of, did the U.S. history in the African slave trade affect the U.S.-Moroccan relationship? It did not. For the most part, the states of Northern Africa were slave trading states. There was no issue on their part with the United States enslaving blacks, to the extent that there were issues, and we've talked about this in previous discussions when we've talked about Egypt. Egyptian black slaves were seen in the United States as similarly being a violation, especially by the 1860s, of the requirement not to keep slaves, and the Egyptians defended their practice of enslavement, arguing that it was functionally different than the chattel form of enslavement in the United States. There are debates as to whether how accurate that is, especially if we're talking about the Egyptian enslavement of the Sudanese in the Turkish Sudan period. So, but back to what we're looking at. So we've got Morocco under attack by the French, and what the Moroccans were able to do was to look out to other powers in the world other than the French in order to prevent the French from fully incorporating Morocco into its own territory, to launch an invasion of Morocco that would look very similar to the invasion of Algeria. And the way that they did this was by cultivating relations with the British. And the easiest relation that they cultivated with the British was with John Hay Drummond, who was a British envoy and represented the goals of the British. Now, the British didn't want the French to have direct control of Morocco at this point, primarily because it would solidify French control of North Africa. By keeping Morocco at least semi-independent and proposing large-scale economic trade deals with Morocco, the British could, in theory, keep the Moroccans buying British commercial goods, sustain the British economy, and this would be better for Britain than if it was part of the French system, because if it was part of the French system, it would no longer be trading with the British for their finished goods. And so the British were apt to maintain an independent Morocco, and Morocco saw this possibility of independence as desirable. Therefore, they aligned more closely with the British. Another way that the Moroccans tried to appease the British was through the reception of dignitaries who would make human rights requests for the subjects of the empire. In particular, when it came to Morocco's Jewish subjects. Giving permission to Morocco's Christian subjects was very difficult because Morocco had very few Christians in its local population, and those who were Christian typically were those who had been captured through slavery. One of the things that we have to remember is that slavery in the Mediterranean was often the capture of European coastal peoples and bringing them to North Africa. So you had among populations of ethnic French, ethnic Spanish, ethnic Italian, even ethnic Irish in some instances. And so giving rights to those Christians would mean emancipating those slaves. And that was simply not in the cards for a country that was much weaker in terms of its centralization. But giving rights to the endemic Jewish population was. And so Moses Montefiore, who was a British Jew himself of Moroccan Jewish extraction, had visited a number of Jewish communities throughout the Islamic world, especially those in Syria, for example, trying to gain them rights and freedoms. He was received quite well by the Moroccan Sultan at the time, the Moroccan king at the time, and the king decreed that you would have better treatment for Jews. In particular, Montefiore railed against certain restrictions on Jewish movement and Jewish professional practice, that Jews were limited to certain professions. Ironically, in many cases, the limitation for Jewish professions in Morocco was around artisanry, that Jews were required to be artisans or financiers. In other parts of the world, especially in Europe, Jews were required to not be artisans. But regardless, Montefiore made a number of inroads there. He also made a number of inroads against child marriage. In Morocco, it was legal at the time for a 12-year-old girl to be married. including in the Jewish community. And Moses actually opposed the will of the Jewish community in Morocco to have the king enforce a decree that would require an older marrying age. Despite the fact that Christian slaves could not be protected, one of the negotiations that the British made, and was supported by the Spanish and French, who also maintained populations within the country, is that you would have a consular protege system. And this system would be that a consul or a foreign worker who is representative of his government in Morocco would be allowed to hire Moroccans, and those Moroccans would be insulated from the legal system in Morocco. They would be subject to the laws and requirements of the home country, not of Morocco. And as you can imagine, this system started relatively small group of individuals, and it began to expand to increasingly large numbers of individuals who would be coincidentally related to or connected to or the family of or somehow related to the Moroccan workers. So until you got this mushrooming effect where one consul could give extraterritorial status to hundreds of people based on their relationship to him. And we begin to see that the French are not the only serious threat to Moroccan independence. The Spanish are also beginning to expand their ambitions with regards to Morocco. And one of the things that we see is that the Spanish have already controlled 2 cities on the northern edge of Morocco. You can see in the map there, those cities are with red dots. That's Ceuta and Melilla. Ceuta has been under Spanish control since 1680, I want to say, and Melilla since 1497. So these cities have been under Spanish control for a significant amount of time. That said, they were maritime colonies like the Portuguese had maintained before them. In fact, Ceuta, before it was a Spanish colony, was a Portuguese colony that was transferred to Spain. Because these colonies were surrounded by hostile territory, it was very common for the local Amazigh tribes, the Rifian Masmouda, to attack these positions. Now, the Spanish made the argument that their advance towards the city of Tetuan was based on these raids and an attempt to counter them. And that's certainly a possible explanation. The other possible explanation, and the view that the Moroccans typically have, is that the Spanish saw this as an opportunity, now that they were militarily strong enough, to advance toward Tetuan, which would eventually become their capital of Spanish Morocco in the 20th century. What ends up happening is that the Spanish, after a few difficulties, are successful in taking Tetuan and defeating the Arabs and Amazigh. So Sultan Mohammed IV, who was the king of Morocco, basically makes an agreement called the Peace of Wadi Ras with the Spanish. And this peace is deeply humiliating for Morocco. And it's humiliating for a variety of reasons. The first one is that the Moroccans were required to pay 20 million Spanish dollars in indemnity, which was an absurd figure that the Moroccans could not afford. And until the Moroccans would pay that indemnity, what would end up happening is that the Spanish would be able to occupy the city of Tetuan. Now, the British were able to intervene and pay that indemnity, but because now the British had paid the indemnity, the Moroccans were locked in an alliance with the British and forced to allow more British goods to come in with fewer tariffs, and therefore deplete the possibility of Morocco ever industrializing in a serious way. The next piece of the Peace of Wadi Ras, which is a source of consternation from the Moroccans, is that the Spanish argued that they had controlled a territory in the southern part of Morocco called Santa Cruz de la Mar Pequeña. The problem was, of course, the Spanish couldn't figure out where that was. So they just chose a city that they thought was in the general vicinity. And this city that they chose was Ifni, or Sidi Ifni. And so the Spanish, by dint of this, got themselves another colony. But instead of being a strictly maritime colony, Ifni included the land territory around it. And this would instantiate Ifni as a precursor to large-scale Spanish colonization. And it would give the Spanish the ability to attack from the south should they need to encircle Moroccan forces. So Sultan Muhammad IV was now stuck in this situation where he had an immense burden to pay. And ordinarily, he would be able to use customs duties to offset any difficulties in tax revenue that he would have. But since now those custom duties had to be lowered on account of the British paying off the Spanish debt, he had to find a different way of amassing that money. And so he turned to the provinces and he increased taxes tremendously. You can imagine that all of the different tribal leaders, the sheikhs, were not terribly interested in paying additional revenues to the Sultan, and many of them began to revolt. In order to quell the revolts, Muhammad IV had a complete reorganization of the internal structure of Morocco. He appointed individuals called qa'ids, or leaders, and these qa'ids would have control over different regions, supplanting the local sheikhs and taking their authority. In many cases, the qa'id of a region had nothing to do with the local population, and so there was a lot of enmity, especially between Amazigh of different clans and different types in different regions. That said, the qa'id who were successful in defeating the sheikhs and forcing those under them into their own authority were the ones who managed to control large stakes of Moroccan territory, and in turn, they agglomerated much more power to themselves than the sheikhs had ever had. And so the qa'ids began to ask themselves, why should they pay the taxes further on to the Sultan Muhammad IV? They had more power to resist. They had the power to keep that money for themselves. And so what Muhammad IV's reform ended up doing is what is called qa'idization, where Morocco, which was somewhat unified with a strong degree of autonomy, typical of medieval states, became increasingly feudal with less and less power arrogated to the Sultan and more autonomy as we go forward. In 1880, there were additional requirements that Moroccans extended, especially on the protégé system and the ability of European citizens to live in areas of Morocco. You began to see some pushback from the Moroccan side in terms of trying to alleviate the pressure, and you see this under Sultan Abdulaziz IV. Now, Abdulaziz was stuck in a very difficult position. He needed to understand, crucially, what foreigners were going to do and what their economic systems were, what their political systems were, what their goals were. And so he brought to him a number of foreign advisors. But it's not as if those foreign advisors would come without their own prejudices and their own desires in terms of how they wanted to shape Morocco. And so he found it incredibly difficult to get foreigners who would advise him helpfully in terms of the modernization of the country. That said, he was able to build arms factories and begin producing his own weapons in defense of the country. But in order to do this kind of overhaul, he needed to employ more taxes, which created more dissension among the various qa'ids. This resulted in two large-scale rebellions against his rule. Probably the most famous is that of Ahmed Raisuni, who controlled the Rif area in the north of Morocco. And the Raisuni was particularly aggressive in terms of his method of negotiation. Typically, he would take foreigners who had started living in Morocco and kidnap them in exchange for large ransoms. In fact, this is the first time that the United States has a deployment in the Middle East. It's what's called the Protectorate affair. It happened during the presidency of Teddy Roosevelt. And Ion Perdicaris was a Greek American who was working in the city of Tangier. He was abducted by Ahmed Raisuni in exchange for $70,000, which was a significant amount of money at that time. And the ransom was eventually paid. Never mind the fact that the US tried to use a bit of gunboat diplomacy in order to get him back. One of the issues, of course, was that Sultan Abdulaziz didn't control the areas under Ahmed Raisuni's control. Ahmed Raisuni was effectively a rebel, keeping away the Sultan's own armies. We also see a lot of connectivity as Morocco takes out a number of loans to finance the construction of railroads. And almost all of these contracts are awarded to the British because the British are seen as guaranteeing Morocco's continued independence. The last thing that really doomed the future of Morocco as an independent state is the Zahir with regards to censorship. A Zahir is sort of a decree, a royal decree, and Sultan Abdulaziz IV required bookshops to censor their content, which resulted, unfortunately, in the inability of Moroccans to access the wealth of information coming from Europe. They simply couldn't print anything. And in fact, religious institutions relied on books coming out of other parts of the Arab world. With regard to secular information, Moroccans were basically in the dark. And Morocco's situation would have gone well, but for a fundamental change that was occurring in the political situation. The traditional enemies, England and France, were beginning to make up and join each other in what's called entente cordiale, or the cordial entente. And in 1904, the British and French signed this treaty. And this is disastrous for Morocco because pretty much until 1904, they had used the British against the French to prevent the French from taking them over. If the French are suddenly on the same side as the British, it means that the British are probably not going to defend the independence of Morocco anymore. And so you see Morocco looking for other potential partners. Into this mix comes the Second Reich, the German Empire. And so Kaiser Wilhelm actually comes to the city of Tangier in what's called the First Morocco Crisis in 1905, where he tries to court Morocco's approval, and the Sultan marches with him and discusses the possibility of German-Moroccan cooperation. This, of course, is not allowed to stand by the French, and now the British being on the same side. What ends up happening is that in Cartagena in 1907, King Edward VII of the UK and Alfonso XIII of Spain agree together that Britain will recognize Spanish claims. And previously, during the negotiations for the Cordial Entente, the British agreed to respect French claims to the rest of Morocco. And so, in many respects, the British are now bowing out of protecting Morocco, and both the British and the French are refusing to accept German participation in the Morocco situation. All of this effectively means that Morocco is going to be carved up very, very soon. And the actual invasion starts with the murder of Emile Montchamp. So Emile Montchamp was living in the city of Oujda in the eastern part of Morocco, and he was stoned to death by a number of local Amazirs. The Amazirs killed him on the belief that he was a spy for France. It's unclear whether or not he was by historical record. Regardless, the French used the death of Emile Montchamp to begin attacks against Morocco. General Lyoté, who was based in Algeria, launches a French invasion to Oujda from the Algerian border and quickly defeats the Moroccan garrison there. At the same time, French boats begin to bombard Shawiya, and they do this because in the Shawiya, which is a grassy region around Casablanca, there were increasing attempts for the foreigners to be expelled from the region. These bombardments led to a number of fights between the Moroccans and the French, such as derailing French trains. But ultimately, the French bombardments and the invasion of Oujda were successful in bringing French control to a significant portion of coastal Morocco. You can actually see in the lower left-hand side, this was from the Arab side. It's the comparison, in their view, between the French bombardment of the Shawiya, in particular the city of Casablanca, which is in the center of the Shawiya, with the attack in Egypt at Danshinwai, which we talked about, where the British killed a lot of local peasants. In both cases, you had the imperialist power targeting large civilian populations as a form of military prowess. Given that Abdulaziz IV had so many relations with Western states, there was a strong push for him to be expelled from Morocco. And Abd al-Hafid, who was coming from the city of Marrakesh in the south of Morocco, another member of the dynasty, was supported in terms of replacing him, provided that he wouldn't work with the Europeans. And so you have what's called the Hafdiyya, where Abd al-Hafid replaces Abdulaziz IV in what's effectively a coup d'etat, and you can see Abdulaziz fleeing Marrakesh after the battle. But Abd al-Hafid was only going to be supported for so long as he was going to continue the struggle against the Europeans. In one of the strangest royalty discussions within Moroccan history, Muhammad al-Qahtani and a number of other tribal chiefs only offered their oath of allegiance if Abd al-Hafid was able to remove the Europeans. Any action that was not related to that goal would cost him his title. Al-Qahtani and others wrote about how the Moroccans should rise up in jihad against the increasing European threat, and that's what you begin to see. Despite that, the French forces begin to invade more and more into the territory of Morocco, and you can see the territories that they took during the reign of Abd al-Hafid in the pink, the completely shaded in pink region, all around Casablanca, where the French began to secure their position. The Germans tried to use the French invasions as their own tool in terms of their colonial desires elsewhere in Africa, and sent a number of their ships to Agadir along the southern Moroccan coast. These German actions were able to get them the concessions they wanted elsewhere in Africa, but after they got those concessions, the Germans effectively bowed out from the possibility of being a protector or guarantor of Moroccan independence. Seeing the writing on the wall, Abd al-Hafid went into exile rather than sign a treaty with the European powers, and the Europeans chose a new Sultan, Yusuf, to take the throne, and he would be under their direct authority. You can actually see in the picture Lyoté in the middle of the picture with white hair, overseeing Yusuf accepting Abd al-Hafid's abdication. So this moves us into the Protectorate period. And Hubert Lyoté, who we've seen before because he was the one who invaded Morocco from Algeria, he becomes the resident general. And he decides that what he's going to do is keep the Moroccan system relatively intact. He's going to keep the king governing. He's going to make sure it's a majority Moroccan consultative body, and he's going to appoint nobles to that body from the Moroccan population. That said, of course, he's going to choose nobles who are amiable and supportive of French interests, but it will be a Moroccan government run by Moroccans just for the French. At the same time, as we pointed out with the previous map, just because the French now had a protectorate in 1912 didn't mean that they actually had the control of the majority of the country. And so Lyoté had to expand his military control to other parts of the region. You can see from this map of the pacification of Morocco that the High Atlas Mountains, or Haut Atlas, were an effective border in the early period of the Protectorate in terms of how far Lyoté could extend his authority. This is, of course, the area where the Zenata majority changes to a Masmouda majority. And the Masmouda were much less familiar with foreigners, much more willing to resist, and they had terrain that would support that. In fact, during the 19-teens, you had large-scale rebellions throughout the Atlas Mountains. And these revolts culminated in what's called the Zion Revolt. The Zion Revolt picked up steam during World War I, as French forces were allocated outside of Morocco to deal with the threat of Germans on French borders. And this led a number of Berber tribes, Amazigh tribes, to begin crossing the mountains and fight the French. Lyoté had created a system of forts along the mountains in order to prevent these kinds of incursions. But during World War I, the Zion Revolt managed to have an incredible amount of success, and it was only after the war and with the introduction of the French Foreign Legion, especially in 1920, that the Zion Revolt was put down. Even though the revolt itself was put down, sporadic clashes would continue to occur throughout the Atlas Mountains until the 1930s. There's a question of, did the French have an equivalent of the British white man's burden mentality? Absolutely. The equivalent in the French world was the Mission Civilisatrice, the civilizing mission. And they believed that they were there to improve the quality of the thoughts and the worldview of the indigenous population over which they were ruling. And part of that was that they were going to stimulate the economy and grow the production capabilities. So what we end up seeing is large-scale resource exploitation, especially phosphates and other mineable goods. We also have modern agronomics that are brought to bear especially in the Shawiya, which is Morocco's most fertile farmland. And what also ends up happening is that you have a new relationship being formed in Morocco, where the French have a specific degree of prestige, a certain number of rights, but at the end of the day, the relationship between the resident general and the Sultan is one where the resident general at least allows the Sultan to have the authority or the appearance of authority. We also see a significant number of Moroccans volunteering for service in World War I. For many Moroccans, World War I was seen as a possibility to escape the situation in Morocco and the possibility to earn prestige. Many of the Moroccans who went were seen as somehow equal to the French, and this will have a bigger role to play in Algeria than it does in Morocco. But it's worth pointing out the Moroccan contribution to World War I on European soil. As we move into the post-World War I environment, we begin to see the problem of the Spanish colonization. Unlike the French, the Spanish were less organized in their ability to maintain the territory, and their territory was composed of a number of mountainous areas called the Rif, which is a combination of Zenata and Masmouda. These areas were particularly opposed to any laws that might be imposed by the Spanish. And in fact, many of the Amazigh clans had their own distinct laws from each other, making them very difficult to unite even during the Moroccan controlled period. So what ends up happening is that you have Abdelkarim or Abdelkarim Khattabi, and he was originally working in the Spanish government, but increasingly he saw the kind of depredations that were going on. You saw general disrespect from the Spanish towards their Moroccan subjects, and he believed that a Muslim-ruled country based in the Rif, in that northern mountainous area, should replace the Spanish control. And he managed to bring together a number of distinct Moroccan groups in order to begin to defend areas of the Rif. At first, he was able to profit from Spanish overconfidence. The Spanish would march into areas where they had insufficient protection from their sea fleet into the mountains, and the Amazigh forces that he controlled would descend upon them. And decisively, in the Battle of Anwal, he completely eviscerated a Spanish captain who was of the belief that Moroccans couldn't fight as effectively as the Spaniards, given that they had a technological disadvantage. This Battle of Anwal is one of the worst wars in all of worst battles in all of Spanish history, and resulted in the creation of the Republic of the Rif, which Abdelkarim ruled for about 6 years, from 1921 to 1927. The Republic controlled most of the territory of Spanish Morocco. You can see that area inside of the red lines. That's the area of Spanish Morocco that he controlled all the way up to the sea. And in that territory, he instituted Moroccan rule for Moroccans and was able to acquire from the Spanish he defeated numerous modern pieces of modern weaponry, such as machine guns. When the Spanish were attempting to take the territory back, they did it without regard to the civilian cost. They repeatedly bombed villages. We've seen very similar tactics at the same time period in Saudi Arabia. And in that case, it was the Saudis asking the English to bomb villages for them, but in this case, it was the Spanish bombing Moroccan villages. There were chemical weapons attacks, and as you can see from this picture of Spanish soldiers holding Moroccan heads, they also dismembered a number of the bodies of the dead. These kinds of attacks and abuses further inflamed the Moroccans and led to a prolonging of the war. What ended up being the death knell for the Rifians was actually not the Spanish per se, but Abdelkarim decided to try and extend his influence south into the areas of Morocco controlled by the French. And the French were much more organized, much more effective, and after allying with the Spanish, were able to put down the Republic of the Rif and put Morocco back under their protectorates. One of the pieces that people often forget is that the history of the Middle East is not just the history of the Middle East per se. It has ripple effects, substantial ones, in fact, for areas outside of the Middle East. And I wanted to draw attention to the Spanish Civil War. Now, of course, there are entire college courses devoted to teaching about this particular conflict, and I'm not trying to caricature what happens there. But a very important part to realize is that Francisco Franco had been part of the Rif War. You can see that picture of him on the left-hand side during that war. And he was a colonel. And in fact, he has said that nobody can understand me without understanding my experience in Africa, referring, of course, to his contributions in the Rif War. And Francisco Franco, as many know, after the Spanish Civil War, became the dictator of Spain from 1939 until 1975. But what's critical about Morocco is that because he had spent his time in the Rif, he was able to consolidate his power early on in 1936, at the very beginning of the Spanish Civil War, in Morocco, using Moroccans themselves. In the case of the Spanish Protectorate of Morocco, just as in other protectorates, the Europeans were able to create indigenous units. Typically, these were called askari. In the case of Spain, they were called regulares. And the army that they were part of was called Ejército de África, or the African Army. Now, these members of the African Army were individuals that, to Spanish civilians, had a very strange, exotic appearance and seemed very evil. And in fact, Francisco Franco actually made it his mission to amplify that sensation, that these were moros malignos, moros being the Spanish word for Moor, a derogatory term to refer to North Africans, and maligno, of course, being malign or evil. He shipped, once consolidating his control in Spanish Morocco, he shipped all of these moros malignos across the strait into Algeciras, and they began to move through southern Spain up into northern Spain. You can follow the arrows that show his areas of occupation. And the Ejército de África, or the African Army, was a key element in Francisco Franco's early victories in the western part of Spain, called Extremadura, as well as concretizing his hold over Old Castile and putting down the Basques. Some of the individuals he brought over by boat, but most he actually brought over by airplane. You can see the Junker, which is a German airplane that, because of the relationship, the fascist relationship between Nazi Germany and Francisco Franco, these Junkers were used to transport the Ejército de África from Africa into Spain. But I wanted to also point out that there were Arabs, although few, who contributed on the Republican side of the Spanish Civil War. Most Arabs, generally speaking, saw communism as the great threat to Islam in the long run, and so they saw fascism as at least being in somewhat of an alignment. And we saw that during our World War II presentation, that, for example, groups in Iraq and groups in Egypt were more aligned with the Germans than they were with the Allies during World War II. Because they saw a link between either fascism and its objectives, again, as opposed to other forms. Najat Sidqi, by contrast, was a communist by orientation. He actually spent time in the Soviet Union. He was Palestinian by birth and by raising, but he spent time in Uzbekistan, where he became a dyed-in-the-wool communist. He then began to work with syndicates in Spain and tried to give his all to fight against the fascists in Spain, seeing fascism and Islam as being directly opposed. In his view, fascism represented the idea of a new distinct religion that would venerate the ruler as opposed to venerating God. It believed in material outcomes as opposed to spiritual outcomes. It was designed to immortalize violence as opposed to seeing violence as the failure of civil society, and a lot of other beliefs. And so he believed that as a pious Muslim, he couldn't be anything but opposed to fascism. And so you have these two chords you can see in the country. Of course, most Palestinians at the time, during the Spanish Civil War, Palestine had its own revolt, and that revolt was against the British. So naturally, there was an alignment with external fascism, even if that didn't manifest in any treaties or direct support from fascist states. So Najat Sidqi was one of the few, but he does represent that there are alternate viewpoints on this. So one of the things that we discussed is that Algiers was itself relatively profitable prior to slavery, but slavery itself, of course, was a massive part of the Algerian economy. And you had all different kinds of slaves. Slaves were often taken from boats that Algerian pirates captured. And so the most valuable slave was actually a doctor. So if you could find a doctor aboard the ship, Algeria lacked the ability to train its own doctors. So recovering one from piracy and enslaving that doctor would be very well rewarded. Europeans, in many cases, would buy back fellow Europeans from the Algerian markets as an attempt to repatriate them. And there was actually a system organized within Algeria where Algerian Christians often functioned as middlemen in these slave buybacks. Of course, that only happened with countries that had the ability to send people overseas to pay for them. There are instances, for example, of Irish slaves, and of course, Ireland was under British occupation at the time, so Ireland could not seek the repatriation of these people. We also talked at length about the Barbary Wars in some of our previous episodes, and this was really the United States' first expression of power outside of North America, and we see some of the inklings of things that would come much later. For example, Pelliu's 9-hour bombardment of Algiers was an element of shock and awe. In fact, it had been done knowing that another 9-hour bombardment would not have been possible. There was not enough shot, but it was able to cow the Algerians into being afraid that another round would come, and so they were willing to desist, demanding that the Americans pay monies for not engaging in piracy. And we can also see with General William Eaton escorting Ahmed Karamanli that they were engaged in a certain degree of regime change, where Ahmed Karamanli was the brother of the current ruler at the time and was proposing peace with the United States if he came to power. Now, that's not how the situation with Tripoli ended up, but you can see sort of the beginnings of these sorts of policies. Now, we talked about how in 1830 that the French began to seize Algeria through the Fan Affair, and then once that had been done, the French had long-standing plans in 1830 that had come from the Napoleonic period of how to invade Algeria, and those invasions along the coast were relatively successful. Once you moved further into the country, as we mentioned, Abdelqadir al-Jaza'iri begins to organize a resistance to the French incursions, and that resistance largely fails, but that resistance didn't fail for want of trying. What ended up happening is that you had a large-scale pacification of Algeria, and that large-scale pacification occurred between the late 1830s and the early 1880s. And it occurred in a lot of different ways. The first one is that the French had a scorched earth policy, burning large sections of ground where those tribes used to live. And they went after a number of local tribes. Some were deported, entire tribes deported to the Levant region, for example. Some were massacred wholesale. The French, in particular, are known for the Siege of La Rouat or the Massacre of La Rouat, depending on who you talk to. La Rouat is a city in the center of Algeria, and the French massacred the civilian population, including using chemical weapons. It's one of the first recorded instances. Remember, this precedes the Riffian War by about 70 years. One of the first instances of use of chemical weapons against a civilian population. And so much of the Algerian interior was either massacred or put to the sword that the Algerians began to call the period the Khalia, or the emptiness. But it managed to secure French control. In many cases, the French would find the douars, or the local Algerian villages, and burn them to the ground. And you had civilians fleeing as effectively as they could to other areas of Algeria to be ahead of French soldiers. Today, many in Algeria, and for the other reasons that we're going to talk about, want the French to recognize the pacification of Algeria as either a democide or a genocide, and French recognition hasn't gone to that level, although Macron has acknowledged certain things. In 1881, you began to have the French re-envisioning the way Algerians would be legally treated. And this was called the Code de l'Indigène, or the Indigenous Code. And the Indigenous Code, in particular, created distinct statuses for different populations within the territory of Algeria. Now, in 1871, Adolphe Cremieux had already granted citizenship to all Algerian Jews, so they became French citizens, but Algerian Muslims were not granted that same status. And so you had a division between what the French and Algerian Jews on the one hand were entitled to do, and the Muslims on the other hand, which was effectively a segregatory system that was deeply insulting to the Muslim population that lived there. There were significant numbers of lands in which they weren't allowed to operate. They were forced out of certain regions, and they had to respect French authority over them. As a result of the moves towards this kind of segregation system and this prevention from them from getting an education, we end up seeing a number of revolts. The biggest revolt in the Algerian colonial period prior to the Independence War, which we're not covering today, was the Morocco Revolt of 1871. So Boumezreg al-Mokrani was a Kabylia, or an Amazigh from the Atlas Mountains in Algeria, and he was able to align a number of the Amazigh tribes together, these Kabylia tribes, to overthrow the French. And in fact, it became a massive revolt over the course of its period, including over 250 different individual clans and representing 1/3 of the Algerian population. In particular, they revolted in 1871 precisely because of what was going on in France at the time. France at this period had just lost the Franco-Prussian War, and that defeat of France inspired al-Mokrani. Additionally, you had Paris being subsumed by what's called the Paris Commune, where Paris went communist, and the rest of France had to fight to re-engage Paris and bring it back into a non-communist France. Seeing that France was engulfed in its own problems, the Mokrani Revolt was able to spread quite quickly, and you can see the areas under its control. That said, the French force was organized afterwards and put down the revolt. Now, there's a number of comments about could French and Algerians go to the same places? Generally speaking, no. A number of the cities had specific sections where French and Algerian Jews were allowed to live, and other sections where Muslims were allowed to live. In most cases, the Muslims were only allowed to live in the Qasba section of the old city, whereas the French and the Jews were allowed to live in modern cities that were built very close to the old city. During this period, we begin to see how the French Empire begins to affect the population of North Africa. And in particular, we see the creation of the Zouaves. Now, the Zouaves were troops of Algerian extraction who were fighting for the French, very similar to the way that you had those Ejército de África troops that were part of the Spanish Civil War. These Zouaves were recruited locally. In many cases, it was one of the few well-paying jobs that Algerians could get. And so you had effective recruitment for Zouaves. And you can see there that they were embarking for Tonkin, which is part of what is today Vietnam. In many cases, the large size of the French Empire effectively meant that Algerians were being sent to all corners of the French Empire in order to fight for its longevity. And it is within the context of trying to put down the Morocco Revolt and other smaller Algerian revolts that the French Foreign Legion really first comes into existence. And the French Foreign Legion was born from Napoleon's desire to include non-French in his armies, but without giving them French citizenship. So they became the French Foreign Legion. But the expansion of this role really happened in North Africa. And you had a number of poor Italians, poor French, poor Spanish, coming to Algeria and becoming part of this French Foreign Legion. It should be noted that France was the military power that supported the Second Mexican Empire, and there were Zouaves from Algeria that were sent as part of that French occupation army in Mexico. In fact, as we pointed out, when the Egyptians sent black slaves from Sudan, it was the Zouaves who translated from their Arabic to French in order to allow the French to give them direct orders. So we now enter a period where the Pieds Noirs, or the French, who literally it means black feet, but these are the French who were living in Algeria, become the dominant power in Algeria, despite being a small minority, right? If we look at the percentages on this graph, the Pieds Noirs represent maybe about 1/8 of the population of all of Algeria. But in terms of governance, they were responsible for 75% of the government-held positions. So you can see how disproportionate their power was. And the Pieds Noirs, when they came to North Africa, they saw themselves in much the same way as American settlers saw themselves in the Midwest and the West, as the West was being tamed. They saw themselves as these pioneers moving into a territory with savages, and they would tame the land and they would control the land. In fact, this was a way that many poor French were able to reinvent themselves. And because everything that they had was built on this system that gave them specific privileges, they were incredibly reticent to change that. In fact, a lot of French politics with regards to Algeria, especially as we move towards the Algerian Independence War, will be of France trying to make rapprochements with the Algerian Muslim population and the colonials, or colons as they're called in French, directly opposing those rules and trying to fight for a more extreme interpretation of the previous law. One of the key aspects of the Pieds Noirs was that they wanted to reform the justice system. One of the key elements is that they saw Islam as being something completely uncivilized and in need of change. So if a person was willing to convert out of Islam, they could be awarded French citizenship. Very few Algerian Muslims took the offer, though. For them, the religion was very important. And so they decided on a different approach. They started to ban the Sharia in terms of its applicability to personal life situations. And so Algerians had to start going to French-run secular courthouses, applying laws that they were unfamiliar with in their own context. You also begin to see Pied Noir districts begin to form, right? As I mentioned before, the Algerian Muslim communities were generally in the Qasba, or the fortified old city, and the Pied Noir are in the more modern areas of the city. In many cases, it would be very rare to hear Arabic in the Pied Noir districts, but you may hear, for example, French, Italian, Spanish, the languages of the colonials. In order to extend to a certain degree suffrage to the Muslims, there was what was called the Commune de Plein Exercice, which was a representative body. And in this representative body, the Pied Noir were 75% of the representatives, and the Muslims were 25%. But not every Muslim was guaranteed suffrage. In fact, the requirements for Muslims to have suffrage were incredibly high. In many cases, it required being a soldier who had fought for France, being somebody who had earned personal distinction. In fact, in many cases, we're talking about less than 5% of the Algerian Muslim population was able to vote for that upper tier position where they would have some say, although minimal, in the governance of French Algeria. Those who did put out for France in a very serious way were often called Beni Oui Oui, meaning sons of the yes, yes, right? In sort of a hybrid of French and Arabic. One such Beni Oui Oui was Colonel Mohammed bin Daoud. He was an Algerian who had fought with incredible distinction, had received a number of different medals. But of course, his most famous story is that he went to a social event in Paris. And at that social event, there were a number of high-level aristocratic French women, and they were shaking hands with most of the French war heroes. When she learned that he was an Algerian Muslim, she pulled her hand back, right? That she wouldn't be contaminated with his Algerianness. And Algerians developed a saying all around this, basically saying, you could even be Colonel Mohammed bin Daoud, but you'll still never be French. And in the conception of the Pied Noir, at least in this period, there's this idea that the Muslims are on the verge always of performing a jihad, that the Algerians were at the precipice of starting a revolt to remove the Pied Noir system, and therefore any exactions against them were designed to prevent this most horrible outcome. And so you can imagine this sort of fear playing in the background of the way that they're running the territory. That said, a lot of things began to change as World War I really came to the fore. As I mentioned, Moroccans served in World War I. We're going to see Tunisians also served in World War I, but Algerians were by far the best represented of the three in terms of their service in World War I. And you had both the tirailleurs and the zouaves, which were infantry divisions, and you had the spahi, which were cavalry mounted divisions. And these divisions fought with bravery and distinction throughout the Western Front. Oh, they also fought, by the way, in the Bulgarian front. You can see those zouaves beginning to set up camp in Greece. The way that they had fought began a new discussion about the equality question for Algerian Muslims. And those questions came in the form of should they receive the same war pensions as Frenchmen? And increasingly, the French population in Metropole France said that they should. They had given as much courage, valor, and distinction as the French from France. They should get the same pension. And there were questions about medical treatment and veterans' benefits and all of these kinds of things, and whether they should be allowed to educate their children. In fact, many Algerians really despised what they had seen in France in terms of secularity, in terms of the way that the church was treated, all of these kinds of questions, but they could see quite clearly that education was necessary to advance. And so for the first time, it was mandated in the early 1920s that all residents of Algeria, be they French citizens or Algerian Muslims, would have access to education, and that education would be able to incorporate Islamic values for the Algerians. There's a question of what percentage of eligible Algerian men fought in the war. I don't have that exact number, but it is on par with what we see from Metropole France. And the difference, of course, being that in Algeria, the Algerian Muslims were not subject to a necessary draft. Of course, many of them went because, as I said, it was one of the few stable wages, and it was a source of honor and pride. But the numbers were quite substantial. We're talking about hundreds of thousands of Algerians serving in World War I, out of a total population of a few million people altogether. All right. Yeah, and so as we move through the early part of the 20th century, we sort of see three different Algerian paths that become enumerated as to how the Algerians will try to. Yeah, and there's another comment that points out that the French promised them better rights if they would fight. And to a small degree that was realized, to a greater degree it wasn't. So the question was, how do the Algerians proceed? And so the first sort of path that was embraced was by the young Algerians. And you can see by that young, they're sort of taking after the Young Turks in that way. And the Journal Law of 1919 was what allowed the Algerians to get an education, what allowed them to begin organizing more effectively and petitioning for their rights. And those who were young Algerians viewed a secular Algerian, valuing French constitutionalism, French republicanism, and eventually becoming part of France, being the ultimate goal for Algeria. Now, on paper, the three regions of northern Algeria were French departments, but of course, Algerians weren't native citizens. So what you end up having is this apartheid system. And leaders like Amr bin Khalid tried to push for increased rights and increased integration within the French system. Amr Khalid himself is expelled very early in the history of Algeria, and Ferhat Abbas inherits the movement. But by and large, the young Algerians peter out by the mid part of the 1920s. It's increasingly clear that the Pieds Noirs are not going to allow any real sense of unification with France, that the fear of that mythical jihad is just too great, and the fear of losing their power is just too great for them to permit Algerian Muslims to become equal parts of French society. And so you have the syndicalists, and they are led by Masali al-Hajj. And Masali al-Hajj sees that the possibility for uniting Algerians is through the syndicates, through the trade unions. And he sees a number of trade unions forming in metropolitan France, and he organizes trade unions that would connect with Algerian workers as well. In fact, he creates an organization called Étoile Nord Afrique, the Star of Northern Africa. And this union, which was ruled illegal in 1929, began to bring a lot of Algerians together and have a sense of Algerian camaraderie, despite the fact that the unification was ostensibly through their labor organization. What ends up happening is that as time progresses, Masali al-Hajj becomes more and more entranced by Arabism. In fact, he meets a number of individuals during his trips to Europe from the Arab world, and these individuals give him the idea to incorporate Arabism into his syndicalist view. And so you end up with a secular-oriented view, right? Because syndicalism tends to be opposed to religious instantiation, but a view that respected Islamic culture, Arab culture, and Algerian uniqueness against the French. In fact, Masali al-Hajj ends up forming Parti des Peuples Algériens, or the Party of the Algerian People, in order to unify this Arabo-Algerian sentiment. The other vein, which grows increasingly prominent during the 1930s, comes from the ulama, or the religious scholars. The ulama argued that, in contrast to the young Algerians and the syndicalists, Algeria should not be turning its back on its Muslim religious heritage. And in fact, a return to religious orthodoxy and a return to the Sharia would be what would allow Algerians to discover their own future as part of a pan-Islamic world. And as a demonstration of these virtues, the ulama would build orphanages and other kinds of schools in order to promote this traditional view. Of course, the ulama were naturally opposed to the French system and saw integration with the French system as being what had effectively led Algerians to succumbing to the French. This opposition to the French system manifested on the French side as viewing the ulama with a deep degree of suspicion and casting them increasingly as the leaders in this mythical jihad that was going to come. And you have a number of these ulama, like Abdelhamid bin Badis, who began to promulgate this idea of leaving France behind and finding Algerian Islam as a dominant form of political systems, and eventually there could be some sort of reckoning with the French leadership. Now, as we discussed during our World War II episode, this brings us to the moment of World War II, and the Americans are able to liberate both Morocco and Algeria through amphibious landings. We talked more about that at that point. And once Algiers and Oran had been taken in Algeria and several cities along the Moroccan coast, these countries were effectively under the control of the Free French. So the Vichy French period and the Free French period during World War II didn't really change much on the ground for the majority of Moroccan and Algerian citizens. As we discussed in the episode on World War II, it did lead to a number of labor camps being constructed, especially for the internment of Jews and the deportation of some of those Jews to the European concentration camps. But by and large, the restrictive system in Algeria survived the war, both under the Vichy regime and under the Free French. And the Moroccan system that Lyotte had built as a protectorate generally survived the war. What really set Algeria, in addition to these discriminatory laws and practices that were very distinct from what we saw in Morocco, what really set Algeria on a collision course was that at the end of the war, Algerians began to celebrate in large quantities the victory over Axis powers. Remember, many just as they had served in World War I, many Algerians served in World War II. The numbers were significantly smaller, though, since France was defeated in 1940, and that set a very different sentiment in terms of recruitment. But many Algerians celebrated, and that celebration was curtailed by the Pied Noir police. Those police ended up opening fire on some of the revelers, believing that they were going to cause a problem. In many ways, this was instigated by that fear that large numbers of Algerians coming together would result in some sort of military overthrow. And the actions by the police resulted then in a number of Algerians attacking Cologne, and then the larger scale French military began retributive massacres. It's estimated that these massacres in Sétif and Guelma killed roughly 30 to 45,000 Algerians. And you can see a memorial in Kherata in Algeria to all of the dead from these massacres. The fallout, of course, will result in increasing estrangement between France and Algeria, even more than it already had been, and lead us on that path to the Algerian War of Independence. So when we talked about Tunisia, similar to Morocco, had a ruler who was trying to invest and use money from the treasury. In this case, he was trying to modernize and did a relatively decent job, but unfortunately, he wasn't able to fund it effectively. And so the rulers of Tunisia instituted new taxes and increasingly were required to use French banks in order to support those loans. That, combined with large-scale conscription, led to a massive revolt called the Mejba Revolt. And this revolt could only be put down with the help of foreign troops. Accordingly, it came to the point where Tunisia accepted, under the Treaty of Bardo in 1881, a French protectorate. And that French protectorate would oversee the payment of all of these loans that Tunisia had. The International Financial Commission had established in the 1860s, to monitor this debt because it came from a number of European sources, and the French were now willing to secure it. And with the development of the Protectorate in Tunisia in 1881, we begin to see a system similar in many respects to what would be implemented in Morocco. Paul Cambon, the first resident general, began to make a number of changes to Tunisia while trying to preserve the Tunisian political architecture. One of the most powerful changes was the creation of the secular Tunisian courts. Now, Muslims didn't have to go to these courts for their own disputes. Sharia was still legal in Tunisia, but any disputes involving foreigners would go to these secular courts and be adjudicated according to French law. You also have the increasing stripping out of power from the Tunisian leadership. And the Convention de la Marsa, or the Conventions of La Marsa, effectively made it that Ali III, who was Bey of Tunisia, had very little power other than as a rubber stamp. And the French chose a new prime minister, Aziz Bouatour, to be effectively their spokesperson. Tunisia had already been divided into areas ruled by the Qa'ids, these tribal leaders. And so it would actually be the French who would choose which Qa'ids could represent which areas. The French would choose the Tunisian ministers in the various levels of government. And so while the government had a number of Tunisians in it, those Tunisians were those that the French had chosen, and therefore reflected French interests. Unlike Morocco, where Lyoté made clear that no French person would serve in the Moroccan government directly, Cambon actually organized it that the French would be the minority of the people there, but they would hold very key positions. And so that way they were able to control the Tunisian architecture while themselves not necessarily being the direct rulers. So once you had that, you also had the Contrôle Civil, which was the French effective police force within Tunisia, and those rulers were able to make sure that the Qa'ids that the French chose would remain in power and that they would follow the edicts of the French. Now, during the colonial period in Tunisia, we had a very different situation than we had in Algeria, and much closer to what we see in Morocco. The first thing is that we have an incentivization for colonizers to come, but most of those colonizers are coming from Italy. They're not coming from France. In fact, it's estimated that about 4/5 of all the colonizers in Tunisia were of Italian extraction, not French extraction. And in order to facilitate their immigration, what ended up happening is that the French passed a number of laws that would force sales of what were called the habous. The habous, or waqf, habous is simply the Tunisian term that they use for this, is a trust and land estate that has been given over to a charitable purpose. And because of that, nothing can be built on it. It cannot be sold in perpetuity. But the French property laws made this land saleable. And so you had these colons all buying territories from the habous, and this caused a great consternation for many Tunisians who saw these places as sacred ground. But on the flip side, you had increasing education as early as 1884, which was far earlier than in Algeria or in Morocco, which was still independent at the time. French language secular schools were open to Tunisians as well as to colons. There was certainly discrimination, but it wasn't l'indigène. It wasn't organized in a clear apartheid style fashion. It was much more personal. And so Tunisians were able to a certain limited extent, go to schools and get education. Trade with France and Italy began to boom because of the presence of large numbers of Italians in Tunisia and because of the connection with France. And this led to a number of French corporations building the industry of Tunisia. We see large-scale telegraph networks, road networks, mining operations. In many cases, Tunisians were hired for lower level positions, and colons were hired for middle tier positions. Most of the colons themselves were poor individuals from the countries of origin, and so they didn't have the skills necessary to run these industries either. One of the other important things to point out during this colonial period is that the French also provided a number of advances to Tunisian medicine. During this period, throughout the Maghreb, especially in Algeria and Tunisia, there were large-scale epidemics. And while in Algeria these were allowed to run rampant, in Tunisia, the French built hospitals and began to improve the life quality for many of the Tunisian citizens. In fact, as you can see from the population graph, Tunisia's Muslim population grows from 1.75 million people in 1881 to roughly 3.5 million people in 1956 when Tunisia got independence, a 100% population increase over the period. As we mentioned, the French and the Tunisians both had a certain degree of power within the structures that the French had allowed to survive. But those Tunisians in those Tunisian structures were representing French interests anyway. They were personally chosen by the French. And so, accordingly, those governances, despite having a Tunisian appearance, were issuing French edicts. In order to give Tunisians more of a voice, the resident general created what was called the Conférence Consultative Tunisienne, or the Tunisian Consultative Conference, where the majority of representatives would be colons, would be settler colonials, but a minority would be Tunisians, and they would be chosen, but they were Tunisians who would represent what Tunisians actually felt like. Probably the most famous of these is Abdeljalil Zaouch. Abdeljalil Zaouch is a pretty instrumental figure in terms of in terms of getting Tunisians to have their own voice. And there were frequent discussions between him and other young Tunisians. They called themselves young Tunisians, these sort of modernizers within the Tunisian Muslim community. And Zaouch's position was that the mejba, or the tax on landed peasants, was too high, and accordingly, more should be taxed from mining operations and other companies that were primarily owned by French. Of course, this was not terribly popular, but it represented for the first time the Tunisian approach to how the situation should happen. You also begin to see Zaouch clashing with other young Tunisians over the question of representation. Some of them said that since he wasn't elected, he shouldn't be so willing to take the office. And his view was, if I can get the office and I can put forward a Tunisian voice, that's much more worth it. He was also more secular aligned than many of the other young Tunisians. And so even his deepest detractors among the colon population argued that he was 200 years ahead of his Muslim co-religionists. Now, one of the first demonstrations of large-scale Tunisian solidarity was over the question of the sale of one of the habous. Now, we mentioned that these habous existed throughout Tunisia. One in particular was founded by Abu al-Hassan al-Shadili. Abu al-Hassan al-Shadili was a Sufi mystic, and many in Tunisia followed his views, and his cemetery in the southern part of the city of Tunis, you can see it there in the red circle, was an area of pilgrimage. Many Tunisians would come to that area to pay respects at his symbolic tomb. He was actually buried in Egypt, but his symbolic tomb is at this habous. But under the land laws that had been put into effect, this territory would be parceled out and sold to colons. Many Tunisians were thoroughly enraged by this. In fact, the mayor of Tunis himself tried to oppose it at every turn, and the French on the city council actually tried to route it around the mayor so the mayor wouldn't be able to oppose it directly. But the mayor pointed out that this was going to happen, and so a large number of Tunisians began to riot. in order to prevent the Sidi Ashadili Habous from being sold. This resulted in a fight over that area, which is called, and that Habous is called the Jalaz. So this affair in 1911 became called the Jalaz affair. Abdelaziz Zawush tried to calm down tensions, tried to facilitate that this territory wouldn't be sold, but at the same time that the Tunisians would go away. Despite that, he was prosecuted by the Colonial government as an abettor of the process, and he was found guilty. That said, he applied for an appeal in a court in Algiers and was found to actually be correct. And the Colonial authorities that had opposed him were required to pay his legal fees. But the Algerian court reporter decided not to report it in Tunis for fear of offending the local Colonial population. And so while Abdel Jalil Zawush was compensated, his reputation was still impugned. Abdel Jalil Zawush and a number of other individuals then began what was called the Tunisian tram boycott in 1912. This was because a tram driver accidentally hit a Tunisian boy. It was believed that the tram driver was drunk at the time, and the driver did not apologize, nor was any compensation paid. So the Tunisians began to boycott all of the trams, and it was one of the first boycotts of its time that was universal in its approach and showed a Tunisian solidarity. For organizing this boycott, many of the young Tunisians, like Zawush, were pushed into exile. So, as Tunisia entered World War I, there wasn't a corpus of Tunisian independence-minded leaders within the country. They were all abroad. And Tunisians began to enlist to fight in World War I. You can see the tirailleurs right there. But because of France's victory in World War I and an understanding that the Tunisians were part and parcel of that victory, a number of these Tunisians returned, including Abdelaziz IV, who began to lead a party called the Dastour Party, Dastour meaning constitution. And it incorporated many of the ideals of the young Tunisians, wanting to create a liberal, Republican-oriented democracy. And they presented their requirements to Nasser Bey being the current Bey of Tunisia, one who is, of course, required to hold to French legal requirements. But when it came to their presentation, he was reticent to accept it. It was his son, Monsef, who convinced Nasser Bey to hear them out. And so from this point on, both Nasser Bey and Monsef Bey, his son, would be seen as championers of Tunisian increasing independence and resistance to French authority, despite effectively being rubber stamps for that authority. In 1922, in particular, there was a crisis in Tunisia concerning Nasser Bey because he floated 18 requirements that he wanted the French to do in terms of improving the rights of Tunisians. The French authorities utterly refused to engage in these rights and instead sent a military escort to Nasser Bey's palace in La Marsa in order to convince him to stand down and accept French control without those 18 points. As we move towards World War II, the Dastour Party remains the dominant part of Tunisian politics advocating for independence. But in 1934, the party splits in two. Tha'albi had gone traveling to other countries to learn other political beliefs, and in that period, some of the Dastourians had the approach that they should be more violent and more aggressive in agitating independence from France. And that group called themselves New Dastour or Neo Dastour, and they were led by a man by the name of Habib Bourguiba. For those who are familiar, he is the one who eventually became the first president of Tunisia. But this split within Dastour greatly weakened the approach that both of these parties, the Dastour Party and the Neo Dastour Party, would have in advocating for Tunisian independence. The Neo-Dustur Party began a number of direct violent attacks, trying to round up members in various parts of the country to support their agenda. The Dusturians also sent Al-Bi to different parts of the country, but by late 1930s, it was quite clear that the Neo-Dustur Party had absorbed the old Dustur Party simply because it was more direct in what it wanted. During the Vichy French period, Jean-Pierre Esteva was made the French consul general of Vichy Tunisia, and he ruled over the territory from 1940 to 1943. During that period, he issued a number of anti-Jewish laws, and Tunisia is the area most affected by these laws. A number of Jews were directly rounded up by Vichy French forces. When Munsif Bey came to power in 1942, he refused to enforce any of the anti-Jewish edicts that had been passed during the reign of his predecessor. And he also called for to meet with the Neo-Dustur Party in order to try and organize a independence. He also called for the creation of a new prime ministership, leading to the resignation of Hedi Lahwa, who had been prime minister now, you can see, for 10 years, and was very loyal to the French in order to create a less loyal group. When the Americans and the British invaded Morocco and Algeria in Operation Torch, they were also able to begin marching towards Tunisia, but this gave the Germans time. And so the Germans launched a direct invasion of Tunisia on the 8th of November 1942, barely respecting the authority of either Munsif Bey or Jean-Pierre Esteva. As we discussed in the World War II episode, the Americans began to march from Algeria to Tunisia, fighting in a number of places. And Munsif Bey was removed from power by the Free French. The Free French argued that he was a collaborator with Esteva and that he should be removed. The general Tunisian position is that Munsif Bey was more in league with Tunisian demands for increasing autonomy or independence, and Lamine Bey, his cousin, was more in line with French continuing to occupy the territory, and so Lamine Bey was installed. There's a question about whether Eisenhower had a role as well. Eisenhower allowed the Free French a free hand in organizing their control of the Maghreb region. The Americans didn't want to maintain an occupation force in North Africa. They wanted to move as quickly as they could to liberating the Italian peninsula, which is where they advanced from Tunisia. So in Libya, you have the Senoussi, which is the dominant religious form there. It's a desert based Sufi group, and you have a large number of Bedouins who are part of this Senoussi clan. Now, during 1911 to 1912, Italy had conquered Libya directly from the Ottoman authorities that had tried their best in order to defend it, but Italy had modern warfare. We talked previously when we went through the Italo-Turkish War how the Italians bombed with dirigibles, which was the first time that had ever been used, and we saw the beginnings of trench warfare. In fact, the Turks were so unable to get to Libya because there was no land connection. Egypt was under British control, that they tried to get through by sea, but the Italians had a better blockade. And so what ended up happening is that some leaders like Mustafa Kemal were able to get to Libya only by faking credentials to get into Egypt and then crossing the border illegally. And when the Ottomans surrendered, this put Libya under Italian occupation. Now, when the Italians began to occupy the territory, they began to push further against the Libyan population. This resulted in attacks against significant portions of that population that had been, especially because they could see how organized the Senoussids were. And despite the Turks giving the Italians free rein in Libya, the Senoussids weren't willing to do so. So Omar al-Mukhtar gathered a Senoussi military force, and that military force would work together in order to in order to resist Italian control. This resulted in pockets of Algerian resistance that would be put down by military police. That became incredibly difficult for the Italians to maintain, and so they sent Rodolfo Graziani, a general in the Italian military, in the late 1920s in order to put down the situation, and he did so through various different means. First, he brought large-scale tanks to Libya and began to round up the population. One of those roundups resulted in the Agadir concentration camp, where torture and repression of Libyans occurred in significant numbers. The next was that he would have his soldiers indiscriminately slaughter livestock that belonged to the Bedouins, meaning that their livelihood would be cut off. And then further, he would put a piece of wire, a fence on the frontier between Libya and Egypt. Many of these Bedouin crossed between that border, looking for grazing lands periodically. And so by doing all of these three things, he was effectively able to cut the Libyan resistance by removing any possibility of Libyan population. When Omar Mukhtar was finally captured in September of 1931, he was arrested and the Italians executed him, despite holding him in very high regard for his abilities as a fighter. The next thing that we have to point out is that Italy wanted Libya to be a colonial society, just as the way that the French had ruled Algeria. And so you began to see Italian colonists making their way to Libya, and that they would be able to expropriate lands from the Waqf, similar to the laws that have been instituted in Tunisia, in order to clear the Waqf there. The Italian colonists actually ended up basically in the 5 major coastal cities, and with the majority of the rest of the population being majority Tunisian. One of the interesting distinctions, though, that Mussolini has relative to the French is that he claimed to be the defender of Islam. One of the things that we saw in the early part of the Tunisian conflict was that Eritreans were mobilized from Italy's colony in Eritrea in order to put down a lot of Omar al-Mukhtar and his jihad against the Italian control. And you also had the Carabinieri, who were the Italian police forces putting that down. But by the time you get to Benito Mussolini, he's considering himself the sword of Islam, the protector of Islam. And so he permits Muslims to go to their own schools and to learn their own laws and to practice the Sharia within the country. In many respects, there's a debate as to whether this is part of his attempt to control all the Mediterranean and therefore being embracing of different views in the Mediterranean, or the fact that he was opposed to the British and the French, and by bringing the Muslims to his side, perhaps he could galvanize them to fight against the British and the French as well. One of the funny things that I like about this picture is if you look at the red circle, you can see a guy holding a horse by the reins. That guy was actually edited out of the photo that was circulated in Italy, and as part of early fascist propaganda, removing anything so it would look like Mussolini was controlling the horse by his own power. One of the interesting shows of the possible incorporation of Libyan Muslims is that they could get a cittadinanza speciale, or special citizenship, if they demonstrated loyalty to Italy. That could either be from fighting in the Italian army or through other acts that showed clear connection to Italy. Now, they weren't allowed to move to Italy with this citizenship, but they were Italian citizens in Libya and were privy to all the same rights, or most of the same rights, that the colonos, the colonized population from Italy, had. Some of their children could become part of fascist scouting groups. And in fact, you had the Associazione Musulmana del Littorio, or the Muslim Association of the Littoral, which represented Muslims interested in being part of a fascist society. And of course, we discussed during World War II how a significant part of the war occurred in Libya, where the two sides would fight forward and back. In fact, there were 3 different phases where the Italians would push out, the British pushed back, the Germans then took over for the Italians, and pushed forward. The British pushed back, and then the final push resulted in the British being able to bring Libya under British control by the end of the war. So questions, comments, clarifications, please put those in the chat. And while I'm waiting, I'll sort of explain a little bit about who we are. This is History, Mostly Ancient Discussions. I'm Richard Sassoon. I do the Middle Eastern History series every week. Next week, we're going to have to skip it, unfortunately. So I'll see you in 2 weeks for Secular Arab Politics. But there are also a number of other series that we do. We have Asian Philosophy, European Union Security in February. We have a series on powerful women. We have a series on dead languages. We have a series on Greco-Roman civilization. All these kinds of things. And of course, we recently had an episode on the Russo-Ukrainian War. We may have one again soon. And periodically, we have a series on Islam 101 and the basics. That is what Sabil Ahmed and Nurul Saeed. And then we have older series that you can see on our YouTube page. So yeah, so let's see some of those questions. There's a question, I do wonder how Ethiopia never got colonized. Was it their warfare tactics? A little bit of that. The first thing is that the Ethiopians maintained strong relations with the French and the Russians. And so they were able to import large numbers of French and Russian weapons. The other thing is that the group that attacked them was the Italians. So the Italians were the least able of the colonizers. And when you got further and further from the ocean, they were less able to consolidate their position. That combined with the hilly terrain and Ethiopia having fought off Egypt. Remember when we talked about expansionary Egypt under Tawfiq Pasha, under Ismail Pasha, that Egypt was also repulsed by the Ethiopians. So the Ethiopians had a long history of keeping out invaders, relatively unified country, and the ability to get weapons from abroad. So the combination of those three really allowed them to be in a unique position. And it's pretty much the same position Morocco was in until the British chose to ally with the French. The fact that the French and the Russians never aligned with the Italians was what effectively made it possible for Ethiopia to resist. There's a question of, can I give a short summary of what we've seen here? Sure. So we've seen that the Maghreb region was subject to a number of different colonization styles. It wasn't unified across the region in the same sorts of behaviors. Algeria stands as an extreme outlier in terms of the depravity of the treatment towards the Muslim population and the rampant inequality between the colonizer population and the indigenous population. That said, we do see a degree of discrimination in all four of them, and we see a result of that being that you begin to foster these national identities where those national identities didn't exist before. You also see that Morocco doesn't unify behind any political ideology moving forward. And in fact, this gives the opening for the king of Morocco to assume the large portion of advocating Moroccan independence, which we're going to see when we talk about Moroccan independence. And the consultative conference in Tunisia sets up the stage for a republican system. It could have been a constitutional monarchy if it had been Monsef Bey in power, but with Lamine Bey, in his connection to the French, that wouldn't be tenable. The Algerian situation was so extreme that only a military conflict would really solve it. And the Libyan situation was just sort of strange, and the Italian presence there never really became something where the Libyans felt the need to respect it. And in fact, the Senoussi structure would reestablish itself when the first king of Libya became a Senoussi king. So you end up seeing in many respects that the outcomes that those countries started seeing in the post-war environment are directly related to how they reacted to how the colonization was imposed upon them. And there's a question of, in totality, which European country did the most damage in that area? I think it's quite obviously France. France had the largest amount of territory, and the actions in Algeria. I think there's a very colorable claim that it's a genocide in terms of the pacification of the country, mass deportations, the use of chemical weapons against civilians. So I think that in terms of colonization, it was the French. Now we can talk about what was the repression under the Nazis, but the repression under the Nazis was small and it was targeted towards a very small portion of the population. So that would be my question on that, my view on that. Any other further questions? All right. So given that there's no more questions, I think I'm going to close it out. Thank you, everybody, for coming, and I'll see you in 2 weeks.